hello, online people. We've got a group of people online as well who are very, very welcome. And I just wanted to start by taking us back in time to the Buddha's day about getting distracted in meditation, because I don't know if anybody here found themselves distracted during that morning meditation. Did anybody get a little bit of distraction at least? One or two people did. Now, there are two kinds of distraction you get in meditation, aren't there? One of the kinds is that comes from inside, where you suddenly remember things, you start planning and thinking about things or worrying about things, or you get pain, talking to somebody downstairs, getting back pain while they're meditating, very difficult to meditate. The other kind of distraction in meditation comes from the outside. And so this morning we had banging noises from workmen next door and power tools from outside as well, and all that kind of thing. Did anybody notice that? Because I noticed it, but some people did notice it. Some people just don't notice these things. It's fine, it goes on. But just imagine that if somebody had bopped you on the head while you were meditating, that would probably be distracting. So this is what happens, and it's a story about two of the followers of the Buddha in the Buddhist time, Sariputta and Moggallana. Now, they're very interesting characters. They were very important in the early Sangha. In fact, they did a lot of the teaching in the early Sangha. The Buddha wasn't the only one who was teaching. But before that, if we go back to their earlier lives, they were close friends, and they both decided they really wanted to find how to gain enlightenment. They really wanted to find how to find an authentic spiritual path that would take them all the way. And so they made a pact. They said, you go east, I'll go west. We'll look around, we'll see if we can find a teacher who can actually show us how to lead an authentic spiritual life. And the pact was, whoever finds such a person will immediately go back, grab the other one of us, and then we can follow them together. And so Sariputta met the Buddha, was very impressed, said, this is it, let's go for it. Buddhism is for me. So he went back, found Moggallana, and they both became disciples of the Buddha. Now, one day, they are both sitting in meditation. And I don't know if you've ever seen Sri Lankan Buddhist monks. They like to have their head properly shaved, because you don't have any hair if you're a Buddhist monk or a nun, or at least not in the southern Buddhist countries. And Sri Lankan monks, has anybody ever met a Sri Lankan monk? It's often quite shiny. Did you ever quite not? Sometimes they have a bit of stubble, but usually they really shave it well and give it a good polish. And so what you've got to imagine is that you had an aerial view of these two monks sitting there. Imagine you had an aerial view over from the top. You're looking down, they're in the open air, I should say. They're meditating in India in the open air. And there's this very, very shiny head. Meanwhile, they're two close friends, yeah. Two other friends turn up. Now, these two other friends, close friends, are genies, according to the legend, at least according to the story. They're genies, or what was called in ancient India a yaksha. They've got a number of qualities, yakshas. They're very, very fierce and aggressive, very powerful. So like some of the genies in the Arabian Nights, or the one that comes out of Aladdin's lamp. But also they can fly through the air. So these two genies are flying overhead. And what do they spot? These monks with Sariputta with his very shiny head. And one of the genies says to them, I dare you, I dare you. And the other one says, no, I'm not, no, God, I dare you. Give him a bop on the head. It's just too tempting, it can't be resisted. And so the genie swoops down and gives Sariputta an enormous bop on the head in the middle of his meditation. And it says, in the story, it says, it would have been enough to fell an enormous bull elephant. So that's quite a hefty bop on the head. Anyway, they finished their meditation. The genies, come out of the story from this point on, but they finished their meditation. And Moggallana looks at Sariputta and said, that is incredible. That was incredible. Did you feel that? And Sariputta said, what? And Moggallana said, did nothing happen to you? He said, I got a bit of a headache in that meditation, actually. And Moggallana says, you are just amazing. The amount of concentration you've got to be able to carry on meditating when a genie comes along and sorry, what genie? What do you mean genie? He said, yeah, didn't you see them? These two And Sariputta says, "You are amazing, Moggallana. I've never met anybody who has such a sensitivity to supernatural forces as you. I can't see genies. I've never seen one in my life. I've never even seen a mouse sprite," he says. And so the reason I mentioned this little story is because it sort of represents a theme I wanted to go into today, which is the theme of friendship. That in a way, these two guys are giving each other just a lot of encouragement. They're really friendly. There's a bit of a contrast with the friendship between the two genies, which, you know, really they're not really encouraging each other to be skillful from a Buddhist point of view. I mean, so, you know, if you have friends that encourage you to go around bopping people on the head when they're trying to meditate, that's not a very constructive sort of friendship, you know. Okay, so that's the sort of thing I wanted to talk about. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is because we have a theme at the moment. And in fact, the theme is for the whole year. And the theme for the year is Sangha. Now, Sangha, as probably most of you know, is one of the three jewels. We've got three jewels, which you can see on ordained people's cases. The yellow one is the Buddha, the potential that everybody has for enlightenment. The blue one is the Dharma, the path that takes you to enlightenment. But with equal value with the other two is the Sangha jewel, which is the jewel of community, of connection, of friendship. And it seems to me that the Sangha jewel, one of the most important things about the Sangha jewel is it's to do with actual real links that we have with each other. It's not just the name of an organization. It's not the Ratnaprabha Buddhist community or something like that. That is not Sangha. Sangha is actual connections that people have with each other. And some of those connections need to be ones of genuine friendship. And you could say that the most Sangha-like of all connections are the connections of friendship. And maybe in a sense, they're the strongest and deepest connections we have. In the West, we are quite dazzled by love. And so it may be that our close romantic relationships are, for us, the deepest and strongest relationships. And they can also be friendships. But it's only when they turn into a friendship as well that they become genuinely long-lasting. Romance and sexual attraction is something that can come and go, while friendship can be a lifelong thing that can really last for your whole life. So they're always important in Buddhism, friendship and connections. And it's worth just thinking about, you know, do I have connections of that nature? Do I have friendships of that nature? And maybe also to think, are they of the type that Sariputta and Moggallana had with each other, or are they of the type that the two genies had with each other? And the Sariputta and Moggallana friendship, obviously, on the one hand, what I really stressed there was their appreciation of each other. They were full of praise for each other. They really liked being in each other's company. They had this incredible loyalty as well. But there's another side to their friendship, which is important, which is that it was a friendship that was sort of mediated through an ideal. They were both trying to gain enlightenment. And that made it, in a sense, a different kind of friendship. What's called, in English translation, a spiritual friendship. But the old word for that is kalyana mitrata. Mitrata in Sanskrit means friendship. Kalyana is very difficult to translate, but it means, it can mean beautiful or lovely, but it can also mean sort of elevating and connecting you with something vast, that kind of thing. And this has been very important from the beginning of Buddhism. So this is going to be our theme, looking at Sangha, looking at spiritual community. And there are lots of stories, these charming stories of friendships from Buddhist tradition. But there's one in particular I just wanted to mention, which is to do with Ananda and the Buddha. Now, Ananda and the Buddha were friends, so even Buddhas need friends, which is interesting. So Ananda was one of his disciples who was with him for the last 20 years of his life very closely and memorized all his teachings. And we've got Ananda to thank for having such an extensive body of Buddhist teachings from the very early days still surviving. And once Ananda said to the Buddha, thinking about friendship, he said, wow, this is so fantastic. You know, the friendships that we have with each other make such a huge difference. You know, I think it's half of the spiritual life is to do with friendship. And the Buddha said, not so, Ananda. Not so, Ananda. Ananda said, oh dear, I must have made a mistake there. Okay, so it's not very important, doesn't really matter very much. And what the Buddha said was, it is the entire spiritual life, Ananda. Good friendship, good companionship, good comradeship. When you have a good friend or a companion or comrade, you will develop and cultivate the path to enlightenment. So this is the kalyana element of it, that it's connected with cultivating the path to enlightenment. It's beautiful, lovely, helpful, but also skillful and spiritual. And there are two kinds of those, very broadly speaking. There are positive friendships that we have, and there's also connections we have with people that we regard as mentors or guides. So that's always been important in Buddhism as well, having a connection with people that you feel you can actually learn from. You'll be very, very lucky if you find someone who's completely enlightened. And anyway, would you recognize it? I'm not sure I would. But at least if you find some people around you who you can learn from, but also some that you can have those peer friendships with, which are equally important. So he says, but there is a bit puzzling as to why the Buddha should say that spiritual friendship, kalyana mitrata, is the whole of the spiritual life. How could he justify that? What does that mean? Because surely there are other aspects to leading a Buddhist or a spiritual life. From the Buddhist point of view, at least, there's meditation, there's chanting, there's study of all the teachings and trying to put them into practice. There's working on yourself. So there's another teaching from the Buddha, which I think gives a clue as to what he means. The word for spiritual life here is the Brahma life, the Brahma life. And the Buddha says, if you're trapped in time, which we are, being not enlightened, if you're enlightened, apparently you enter into a timeless realm. But if you're trapped in time, the Buddha says, how is it that you can reach the Brahma state? How can you reach the Brahma life? How can you reach what he called the deathless state of awakening, of actual enlightenment? And he says, you do this by giving up all possessive thoughts, all thoughts of me and mine. You reach the Brahma state by giving up egotism and selfishness. This is a quote from Sangha, by giving up all sense of I. And that's quite asking, giving up all sense of I, that's quite something. Thus, the intimate connection between spiritual friendship and spiritual life starts to come into focus. Spiritual friendship is a training in unselfishness, in egolessness, getting beyond the ego. You share everything with your friend or your friends. You speak to them kindly and affectionately. You show concern for their welfare, especially their spiritual welfare. You treat them in the same way as you treat yourself. You treat them as being equal to yourself. They matter just as much. You relate to them with an attitude of metta, of kindness, and not according to where the power between you lies. So that's so easy to get into a relationship that's based on status or differences in influence and power. But you don't relate in that way. If you learn to relate to your friends in this way, you'll learn to respond to the whole world with metta and with unselfishness. It's in this way that spiritual friendship is indeed the whole of the spiritual life. So this is the clue to it. It's to do with how do you go beyond yourself? How do you go beyond limitations? And you do that in a way by softening the boundary to yourself. And you can soften that boundary best, or maybe the only way you can do it, is by the way you connect, the way you relate to other people, to try to relate in skillful and effective ways. And it does seem to me that human needs merge gradually into the possibility of going beyond yourself, going beyond limitations. In the end, it's something you need to do. You need to go beyond yourself. So if you think about what do you need? What are your needs to be a reasonably okay person, lead a reasonably okay life? And does this, Maslow has this hierarchy of needs, doesn't he? All these different things that people need. But I think one of those is connection with other people. You need food, you need shelter, you need that kind of thing. But maybe the deepest and most important thing that we need is connection. Maybe not all of you feel that, but I think for most people, they'd probably agree with that connection, and connection that's a warm and genuine connection as well. intimacy, in other words. Something personal, something precious and special that is possible only with a few people. You can't expect to have it with everybody. And maybe, okay, that's great to have that when you've got that in place, but it could be then that can take you further. It can take you towards that goal of egolessness or selflessness, going beyond yourself, giving up all sense of I. However, okay, I'm still looking at this thing. How could spiritual friendship be the whole of the spiritual life? Because there are definitely other things that you need. In fact, over Christmas, I didn't spend Christmas with family or relatives. I actually went on a solitary retreat. So I was 9 days completely by myself in a little hut in the Norfolk countryside. So that's not spiritual friendship, is it? But yeah, I did feel that was really valuable. So you could say solitude is not the half of the holy life. Solitude is the whole of the holy life. And very close attachments that you get, they can cause problems. The kind of connections we get with people are not necessarily straightforward. They can become very sticky, and they can be we can have a lot of expectations of people. We can sort of get obsessed with people who are not so interested in us, that kind of thing. And after all, the most basic of all the Buddhist formulas in the Four Noble Truths says that suffering comes from craving. Suffering comes from attachment, in other words. So yeah, if everything was in solitude, though, you just become self-absorbed, wouldn't you? So I don't really think we can say that solitude is the answer to things, which doesn't explain why I went away. And maybe you can ask me afterwards why I decided to do that, and why a lot of Buddhists I know do that, do solitary retreats, really value time entirely on their own. So you need spiritual friendship so that you don't have a self-absorbed life. And that spiritual friendship, it leads into the Buddhist path. And there's another sutta where the Buddha goes into why that should be. The suttas is the name for the old Buddhist texts. Why should it be that friendship takes you into the path? And he goes through it stage by stage. He says, if you can establish genuine, deep spiritual friendships, then that leads you to deciding to lead a more skillful life. In other words, you'll tend to lead a life that is based on kindness and consideration, not just for your friend, but others as well. It leads into that naturally, and you can help each other into that process, looking at the way you live your life and leading it more skillfully. And then that leads you also into the chance to discuss and clarify your own thinking, what matters to you. And this is known as Dhammakata, which means truth discussion. So you've got spiritual friendship leads into being able to be ethical, and that also leads into the possibility of truth discussion, of actually having deep, meaningful discussions and talks with people. And out of that springs virya, which means enthusiasm, energy. So if you can clarify things, if you're leading an ethical life, you'll find you've got a lot of energy, you've got a lot of enthusiasm to put into what you're doing, which I think is very important. And then finally, that leads into insight, wisdom. And in a way, once you've got wisdom, you're halfway there to enlightenment. It's absolutely crucial to have that non-dual, deep, transformative insight. So this is what the Buddha says, that spiritual friendship leads into these things. It first of all leads into ethics, then into the possibility of talking deeply about your life, then into the possibility of the arousal of energy, and through that arousal of energy, insight will arise. And that includes meditating. So it's not you don't meditate, you don't chant, you don't do these other things, but they have a basis in the connections you're making with other people. That's the suggestion, at least. Anyway, whether or not you're convinced by that, I think I wanted to go a bit more practical now and just talk a little bit about developing a circle of friends, how one can do that, how one can work on it. Not that I'm an expert by any means, so these won't sound too sort of condescending. And I'm sure you've got your own approaches to friendship and connection with people. But I really hope that everybody feels that it's important and matters, and feels that it's worth learning how to do it. How can I do this more effectively? How can I make it work better? the connections I'm making with each other. Because especially here in London, isolation is such a big issue, it seems to me. Sometimes we can feel really cut off, really quite lonely. And even with the people that are close to us, we feel, well, I can't really be myself, you know. So if you can find ways through to that, that is so magical, it seems to me. And maybe the most precious resource that we've got to make a start on that is whatever circle of friends we already have. So let's not think that they're not valuable. We've already got probably a circle of friends, I hope so at least. But a lot of us don't have enough friends, or at least they're not the kind of people that we can really share what is most precious in our lives with. They may be more the genie type of friendship, where you're just encouraging each other to bop people on the head, rather than being the Sariputta and Moggallana type of friendship, where you're being very appreciative of each other and you're both on the same path together, sort of thing. So when you do make a new friend, it's not just fulfilling a need that you have, it's also a gift of friendship to that other person as well. So remember, it's like it's a double, what do they call it? A win-win, I suppose. It's a win-win situation, because it's really precious for them as well. Don't forget that, how valuable it is. If you make a friend with somebody, it's valuable for them as well as for you. And in my experience, the best way to forge friendships is to have a project, to be actually working on something together, even if it's a very minor thing. So that's why we encourage things like, you know, when you come and do some volunteering here or join a class team or something, it becomes a bit of a project. But even just attending the Saturday class can be, you can think of it as a project that you're engaged in. I'd like to come to this and I'd like to get involved, and maybe this is a way I'll be meeting people as well. So don't underestimate that side of it. It's all very well Vajramitra leading you through a meditation practice, or Kusala if you're in the other room, or me giving you a talk on Buddhism. But really, in a way, the secret of this class is us as people coming together. That is much more important in a way than the content of the class, in my view. So the Buddha gave some teachings as well on how you make Sangha happen, how you make connection happen. And also, this is also how you make spiritual friendship work. And this is going back again, I'm sorry, jumping back and forth between the present and the past. But there's another old story which I really like from the old Buddhist scriptures about another disciple of the Buddha. And he lived in a remote town, a long way from the center of what Buddhism was in those days. And he was visited by the Buddha, who gave us some teachings. He started practicing. The Buddha went away, came back 5 years later, and discovered he'd started a Buddhist center. He'd started a Buddhist center. A thriving Sangha was there. And this disciple was a guy called Hataka, and he was some sort of a businessman, I think, whatever the 500 BC businessman means. And he already had a lot of friends, and quite naturally, they all started meditating together, and they started following the Buddhist path together. And the Buddha, when he came back 5 years after the first visit, he said, "How did this happen? How did you manage to set up such a thriving Sangha?" And Hataka said, "Don't you remember, before you went away, you taught me 4 things. You taught me 4 things. And these 4 things are going to be a topic for some of our future Saturday morning talks. So we can go into each of them in enormous detail." They said, "You taught me 4 things." And they're called the means of unification. Or in Tibet, they call them the essentials of partnership. How do you bring people together? How do you make connections with people? And these are just worth remembering. I think they're all quite relevant. So this is actually a quote from what he said. "When I can make a connection with someone through giving, then I practice generosity. When I can make a connection with someone through affectionate communication, then I speak to them with kindness. When I can make a connection with someone through helping them out or teaching them Buddhist principles, then that's what I do. And best of all, when I can get into deep harmony with someone through empathizing, through discovering how much we have in common as 2 struggling human beings, then that is the approach that I take." So these are the 4 of them. I say, don't worry if you can't remember, because we will go into them in future weeks. The first one is giving, generosity. And that's really interesting, isn't it? They do say the best way to find friends is to be a friend, don't they? In other words, so if you can offer something to other people rather than thinking of what you get from other people, you'll find naturally some of those connections you make will turn into friendship. Not all of them, but some of them will. Just because you are looking out for other people's needs and saying, yeah, just a bit of giving, a bit of outward going. That's how you break down the barriers that keep you trapped inside in the ego. And then the second one is kindly speech or affectionate communication. So you can, maybe this is obvious, but the way you communicate. One, okay, giving is that's coming from you to them, but now let's get into a two-way communication and let's make sure there's love present in that. And then the third one is being helpful to other people, and maybe even sharing some of your own insights, because we've all got a lot to offer in terms of the experience we've got in life. I don't mean you become a preachy sort of person, but at least you think, I'm really looking out for the welfare of this person, and if I can think of anything that can help, and if they're interested in that, I'll offer that. And the final one, the literal meaning of the word is same-goaledness, if that makes sense. It means reflecting on the fact that we're all in the same boat together, and ultimately, deep down, we have the same goal. It may sound a little bit weird, because obviously some people are Buddhist and some people aren't, but from a Buddhist point of view, all human beings are striving for enlightenment, whether they know it or not, because it's to do with breaking down the basic limitations of one's awareness. And those limitations start off with greed, hatred, and delusion. They start off with a sense of self, separate from everything else. So in a way, deep down, it's always going to be beneficial, whether they call themselves Buddhists or following the Buddhist path or some other path, it's always going to be beneficial to doing that. So if you can feel that deep down, we're all not just suffering the same problems together, not just having some personality similarities, but also deep down, we all care about waking up fully. And that's the fourth of the means of unification, or the essentials of partnership. However, I must say I'm a bit of an introvert. Sometimes I'm a bit of a loner. I loved being there on my solitary retreat, away from everybody else for a while. I wasn't really away from people, of course, because they're there in your mind, even when you're on your own. And I think that shows that friendship is not just to do with being with people. It's also to do with the loyalty and connection you feel with people when you're not together. But nevertheless, I do rather enjoy my own company. I'm not all that good in some ways, I think, at friendship. A bit of a reticence there. And it can be a struggle to enter the world of another person. And how do you do that? How do you enter into the world of another person? How do you connect with another person? Well, it's good, what I found, it's good just to take an interest, isn't it, really? To ask them about their life. How have they got to this point? What really matters to this person? But even there's a lot, that's quite difficult to bring that up, isn't it? You've got to be in a certain mood and a certain type of connection. But another aspect is to empathize with the fact that people struggle. And that I think everybody, it's amazing when you feel people's life stories, how much most people have actually had to get through. All sorts of difficulties, maybe very physical health difficulties, but also psychological difficulties, all sorts of things that people have to face. A lot of pain and disappointment as well as good things. So some people are very, very good at that, aren't they? Of being open and taking in, being prepared to take in the anguish and frustration of others. So when you're learning to communicate with people and making friends, maybe you're connecting with people, it's important to remember that we're not yet at that point of self-transcendence, of going beyond the I, going beyond the ego. All of us are the center of our own universes, and that is completely normal and reasonable to be in that condition. If you're not a Buddha, you are the center of your own universe. So, for example, another story from the past. So Malika, she was sitting on the balcony one day with her husband, whose name was Pasenadi, and they were chatting about things. And Pasenadi said to her, Malika, is there anyone dearer to you than yourself? And I may be wrong, but I think he's probably thinking that she's going to say, because they were well known as a very loving couple, Malika and Pasenadi. And he's probably thinking, oh, Pasenadi, you are the dearest to me. You are always the dearest to me. Ever you will be the most precious person in my life. Of course, darling. But she was a Buddhist and she was wise. She'd done a lot of practice and she was honest. And she said, no, there is no one dearer to me than myself. And then Prasanadi, when he thought about it, he had to acknowledge it, that was true for him as well. There's no one dearer to me than myself. And they both mentioned this conversation to the Buddha when they went to see him. And he said, do you realize what this means? Everybody has that same powerful protectiveness and love for their own life, for their own interests. But if we could only see that we all have this powerful emotion in common, then we would never cause pain to other people. So it's an interesting way of switching it, isn't it? That if you realize how everybody cares so deeply about their own welfare, and you could say, well, that's the same with me as well, then we wouldn't cause pain. We would not hurt other people. We're all the center of our own universe, and that is fine. And this can make you even more considerate to realize this. Your words, your actions have a real impact on other people. And if you recognize the best in other people, they will grow. So give a bit more encouragement, a bit more appreciation to others than you might naturally do. I think that's always worth it. Another example from the old days, this is towards the end of the Buddha's life. And this is with Ananda again. You remember Ananda was this close friend and companion of the Buddha. And when he knew that the Buddha was going to die, he was quite despondent at the thought of losing such a kind friend. But the Buddha said to him, now for a long time, Ananda, you've served me with loving kindness in deed, word, and thought, graciously, pleasantly, with a whole heart, beyond measure. You've gathered great good, Ananda. Now you should make the effort, and soon you too will be liberated. You too will be awakened. And then he talked to everybody else about Ananda. This was his encouragement one-to-one. He said, capable and judicious is Ananda, because Ananda was like his personal assistant. He always arranged all the meetings as well as memorizing all the teachings. Ananda knows the best time for visitors to come and see me. What's more, if people should go to see Ananda, they become joyful on seeing him. If you then speak to them the Dharma, they're made joyful by his discourse. And when he shuts up, they are disappointed. So I think this is quite a good example of appreciation because it's quite specific. You know, it's nice, you might think, oh, you're a great bloke. That might be the way you appreciate somebody, but it doesn't help all that much. But if you can find specific things to say, specific qualities about a person. And today, to do that, you need a lot of continuity. You need to be knowing a person well so that you actually can find some specific things to appreciate. And there's a principle here from mindfulness practice. What you give your attention to grows stronger, they say in mindfulness practice. So the same goes for friendship. If you give your attention to the really good qualities and remind people about them, they will become stronger. It's a really helpful thing to do. If you're constantly criticizing and reminding people about their deficiencies, it may well be that those are what grow stronger. However, sometimes in a friendship, you will probably get annoyed with the other person, get fed up with them. But deep down, you do know two things probably about your friend. This again may seem condescending, I'm sorry if it does, but I'm just thinking, if you think of a close friend of yours and ask yourself two questions about them, even though they may have let you down, they may have been a little bit unpleasant, there may have been a miscommunication. Question number one, was it really malicious? Question number two, was it really stupid? Now, maybe it was. It's not impossible that it was from just wanting to cause pain. It's not impossible that they really were very stupid. But very often, I think it's not the same. So not at heart malicious, not completely stupid. And I think when we're critical of other people, we often forget these two facts. And we maybe imply that they have done something. You did that to hurt me. You wanted me to feel pain. Probably not. Or how could you possibly not realize the effect that would have on me? You must be totally stupid. Probably not. They're just different. And we jump to the conclusion that being nasty or they're missing something obvious. So he or she is not malicious. He or she is not stupid. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt at least at first, until you've got a lot of evidence to the contrary. But on the other hand, it can also be tempting to smooth everything over and pretend nothing is wrong, even when there's resentment simmering under the surface. So maybe something has gone wrong that concerns something that's important to you. You feel badly let down, and to ignore that is not doing anybody a favor. So bringing up uncomfortable subjects is something you need as well. And I've got some final thoughts on friendship, some little tips that I'm going to suggest. And in the next few weeks, we can look at some of these and decide what we think about them. Number one, avoid mind reading. Do you know what I mean by that? Where you assume you know what's going on inside somebody else's mind. The maliciousness is an example of that. You think they're deliberately wanting to hurt you when they were just being a bit clumsy. No, you don't know what's going on in somebody else's mind. Secondly, acknowledge that there are limitations to any friendship. So maybe there are some parts of your life that you will never fully share with that person. It's just not quite like that with them. But you can still be good friends. The third question, I think, which is really interesting, can lovers be friends? Can parents be friends with their children? Can children be friends with their parents? In other words, in very close relationships, natural relationships, is friendship possible? And yes, it is. So any human relationship can include friendship. Any person can potentially be a friend with any other person. You don't choose who your mum is. You do choose probably who your girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever is, but you don't choose who your children are. There they are. And it seems to me that a process of maturing can happen in all those relationships. For example, in a romantic or a sexual relationship, at first it may be very primitive in a sense and need-based, but that gets out of date after a while. And then you can start to see each other as two independent and different and valuable human beings. So a self-oriented love can turn into a disinterested love. That's very possible. I'm sure you probably know couples like that, and maybe also parent-child relationships like that, where it really has matured, and now they are taking each other seriously. Also, it's easy to get into a standard script. I'm thinking of long-term relationships again there, where you can just get into a standard way of relating to each other that ignores part of it. So it's good to acknowledge that you're both changing. You won't be the same. If you've been together 10 years, you will not be the same as you were 10 years ago. So don't get upset with the other person because they're not as they were 10 years before. Of course they won't be. And even rejoice in that change. Introduce some freshness into it, not getting stuck in a particular role. So a friend of mine found that her relationships, she was always the rescuer. And her partners were, of course, people who welcomed being rescued. And after a while, she realized this. I always get into this pattern, and it maybe that just needed to stop. Maybe she needed to find a different kind of person to get involved, but at least not, you don't have to be the rescuer or whatever role it is that you adopt. Endings are important. Last thing I was going to say. So every connection is going to end, at least through death, but very often it ends earlier than that for some reason. It may be a good reason it ends. So I think there's something genuinely lost in every parting, and it's good to grieve. It's good to really feel it, to say there was a lot that was good in that. It's now finished for whatever reason. The kids have left home, the relationship has come to an end for some reason. We've just moved apart, we're distant from each other now, and grieve. It's good to grieve. Don't be too blasé about it. So for example, Sariputta and Moggallana, when they died, the Buddha was still alive. And it's interesting how much he missed their company and said how much he missed them. So again, even an enlightened person will grieve at the ending of a connection. So those are my suggestions. Assume that someone who annoys you is not at heart malicious and is not completely stupid. Try it at least. Maybe you'll be disappointed, but try it. Don't just smooth everything over. Avoid mind reading. Accept that many friendships will have limitations, and that's okay. See if you can turn the bonds of attachment into friendships. Freshen any habitual ways of relating you've got. And when a connection ends, allow yourself to grieve. So that's maybe an exploration, particularly of that idea that good friendship, kalyana mitrata, is the whole of the Brahma life, the spiritual life, as the Buddha said. It's the difference between whether Buddhism and the practices of Buddhism take root in your life and flourish, or whether Buddhism and meditation is just a passing interest. It seems to me, I hope I'm right in that. And I think the only way it becomes something really rooted is if you're making connections with other people who are trying the same things. And it's a very rare person, maybe they do exist, but it's a very rare person who can practice the Dharma without connection and support. So we've just got a few minutes left, and I thought I'd see if anyone has any comments on any of those points. I hope some of it was useful, and I hope there's a bit of a mixture there between some traditional ideas from Buddhism and something which I hope is really relevant to all of us, which is how do we make and establish and keep healthy the connections that we have with each other and in our lives. Any thoughts?
A quick question. I mean, like when we're young, we just make friendships without knowing what their value system is. Like we probably don't have a value system when you're young, especially when you're in school, high school, probably undergrad. But I think as we grow over time, you kind of realize, oh, you have a strong value system, the other person also, but like they are kind of divergent. So do you still find like, oh, because you made friends, you still stay friends, or you look at that angle, or they have something to offer, if not what you're looking for? So how do you navigate those kind of friendships?
So in case people online couldn't hear that, the sense is what you may have formed friends in your early life, which are not based on shared ideals. They're just, you're attracted to each other and it just happened that way. But what about later on? What do you do about those friendships, especially if you find you don't have so much in common anymore? And that's a really good question, isn't it? And I think it's really important to value existing friendships. It's a difficult thing to make a friendship, and to value those connections you've made at school or at university, at college, or in your first jobs, and to keep in touch with people as much as you reasonably can. And also to acknowledge that you may have for example, you may have a band of people and the way you related to each other were just going out drinking. And that was, to be honest, that's what you enjoyed doing, getting plastered together. Now, it may be that you don't want to do that anymore. You're valuing your mental states and your meditation. And you realize when I'm with those people, I'll tend to go back into that, or using drugs or something like that. And in that case, maybe I do need to keep a bit of distance. If I can keep a connection of some kind, that's great. But maybe I need a bit of a distance because they're more the genie type of friendship than the Sariputta and Moggallana type of friendship. So that's what you need to ask yourself, and really cultivate those Sariputta and Moggallana friendships if you possibly can. But don't underestimate other people. Maybe deep down they do have some of those ideals, and maybe you just haven't quite discovered that side of them yet, because they may not do it in the same way that you do. They may do it through a different spiritual tradition, for example, is one possibility. Any other thoughts? Yes.
I was quite interested in your decision to go for a solitary retreat over Christmas time. What principles guide you when you're deciding how much time to devote to loved ones, friends, family versus yourself, and how do you get that balance?
Well, for me, I don't know if it's exactly a principle or just based on experience. I try to have some time on my own every year, and I try to make it 1 or 2 weeks, and that's over the years, that's what I've learned. But I also try and go on group retreats as well. And group retreats are a great place in which to forge friendships. So if you're serious about meditation in particular, you probably will find solitary retreats sometimes valuable. And if you can find a place in the countryside, a little cabin or a little cottage, little Airbnb, where you can just go away and have some time alone, just try it. And sometimes, particularly if you're a very gregarious person, you may find it really weird. You may think, I miss everybody, and you're really tempted to WhatsApp them all and find out what's going on with them. Say, no, let's be strict. I'm just by myself. So I tried to do that. I didn't contact other people during that time at all. And I wasn't looking at emails or messages or anything like that. So I find it good, but you've got to work it out for yourself. But I do suggest that you try it, maybe just for a weekend. Can you just spend some time, even have a solitary retreat at home, just to say, oh, look, I've got nothing on this weekend, rather than sort of feeling lonely and bereft and things. Let's do a bit of extra meditation. Let's just really learn to enjoy my own company. And then you'll be better company for others as well, I think. Yes?
During that time, do you, in terms of your stimulus, is there no music or no reading, or is it just doing that?
I wasn't doing any music or anything like that. So it was different from my normal life. But I was doing reading. But my reading was, at the very beginning, I finished a novel I was reading as a way just to relax into it. But that only took the first day or two. After that, all my reading was Dharma reading. It was all Buddhist reading, as it happens. But I'm not saying that's the way you should do it. You just decide for yourself. The very first solitary retreat I ever did, there was a television in the house I was renting, and the snooker was on. I'd never taken any interest in snooker at all, but I got mesmerised by this snooker. I did it with the sound turned down, just watching this little ding, ding, ding. But that was the only time I ever did that. That was a long time ago. But yeah, you have to work out your own way of having solitary retreats.